Hello everyone, this is part 10 of What If Naruto Was a Puppeteer, and I hope you guys enjoyed this video and to like, to subscribe, to see more comment down conscious as he stood in the middle of the Hokage's office. When the Anbu had dropped by his building to inform him the village leader requested his presence, he hadn't quite expected so much pomp. Shikaku Nara stood to one side of the seated Hokage, the Anbu commander on the other. Danzo Shimura stood in the far corner while the Sandaim's old teammates were seated in the couch. All looked prim and reserved, examining the 15-year-old like a slab of meat. In comparison, Naruto looked a mess. He had been waist-deep inside one of his puppets when summoned, after an all-nighter. His hair was even messier than usual, clumping and spiking out randomly instead of falling into its usual long spikes. Likewise, his clothes were disheveled, the only saving grace being the fresh jacket he had thrown on before leaving. There was also the pallor of his skin and the tight bandages wrapped up the length of his right arm, not to mention the heavy shadows around his eyes that he couldn't even mask with his goggles like usual. Chunin Uzumaki, I trust you are unaware of why you were called here. The Hokage asked, mirth dancing in his eyes as he concealed a small smirk behind steepled hands. Naruto didn't quite trust himself to speak, and risk ruining his image even further in front of so many of the village's big wigs. It regards your mission record, Shikaku intoned dully, tapping the folder on the desk. Naruto thought it looked rather thick, considering his career was only a few years along at this point, but he had no frame of reference. Is there a problem? He asked, careful to keep his tone level. At least two of his big worries were assuaged, and if they had found out about the Hyuga affair, he doubted they would have been as polite as to invite him here. Quite the opposite, Naruto, the Hokage said, waving away his concerns with an absent gesture. We've had our eye on your record for a while now and it has finally been decided that you qualify for the rank of Junin. He smiled as he reached under the desk, producing an olive-green flak jacket. Naruto tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Of all the things he had considered for this meeting, that was not one of them. Your last mission, despite its complications, the Anbu commander stated quietly, not mumbling, but in a tone that forced you to listen carefully, was particularly impressive. Have you considered joining the Corp? The Sandaime chuckled, giving a sly look up at the wolf-masked man. Trying to poach my operative already, Okami? The man didn't so much as twitch, and Hiruzen returned his gaze to the blonde. He was only just now recovering from the shock. But the commander is correct, I was most impressed how you handled yourself against 3 Junin. Naruto gambled and gave something of a cocky grin. Not so hard when you know the ambush is coming. All the same, his hand naturally drifted to his other arm, still wrapped up in bandages. The burns should heal without scars, but damn if it hadn't hurt. Danzo clicked his teeth from his corner, looking displeased with the proceedings. Then again, Naruto had never seen the old veteran look any way else. Something to add, Danzo? Hiruzen drawled, clearly having been expecting this. My complaints are well noted already, Hiruzen. Starting to feel the welling elation that his actions weren't going unnoticed, that his skills were being recognized, in an uncharacteristically bold move, Naruto decided to push his luck. That's an awfully casual way to address your leader, don't you think, old man? He asked the Hokage, earning a faintly amused look. Danzo didn't rise to the bait, merely narrowing his visible eye. Don't press your luck, Uzumaki, Okami stated. It wasn't forceful, or particularly threatening, but it was a tone that brokered no compromise. The blonde was suddenly mightily curious as to who was underneath that mask. That's quite all right, Hiruzen said. I think Junin Uzumaki has earned the right to be a bit glib today. He schooled his features, immediately changing the air of the room back to more serious matters. Now, I'm sure I don't need to tell you, but I feel I should make sure you understand your new position. Naturally, as a Junin you will be able to submit yourself for a Genin squad. Naruto's features scrunched up in displeasure, causing the Sandaime to break his mask for a moment to smirk. Although of course, this is not obligatory. Likewise, you will have full access to Junin-approved areas of the village, including the library, training facilities, and the lounge. Shikaku slipped in with a knowing smirk, earning an eye roll from the older shinobi. And the commissary, he continued smoothly. You will have greater freedom in your mission choices, although you will still be called on for missions at the village's discretion when pertaining to your particular set of skills, or by request of the client. Considering we are still at war, you shouldn't be surprised if you are called to head, lead and coordinate multiple squads of Chunin at a time. Any questions? The moment he shook his head, the others in the room began to shuffle out. Only Danzo paused, to level a glare at the back of his head. Naruto turned to leave as well, feeling dismissed, only to be called back by the Hokage before he could. Just a minute, Naruto. The blonde took the proffered seat, leaning forward expectantly. Some of that previous anxiety must have seeped back into his features, because the Hokage gave a congenial smile. I just wanted to congratulate you a bit more personally. I get the impression these promotions can often be quite cold and officious things. His smile widened a little as he produced a small black book Naruto would have recognized anywhere. It was a lot newer and less dog-eared than his copy though. Plus, I thought you would appreciate this. He flicked the book open to a marked page and slid it across the desk. Already anticipating what it said, Naruto couldn't contain his nervous smile. Sure enough, he saw himself looking back out from the page, the same picture he'd had to take after his Chunin promotion. A little out of date, but he hadn't changed too much since then. Name, Uzumaki Naruto. Aliases, Nun rank, Chunin classification, B, Puppeteer. Ninjutsu, unknown Genjutsu, unknown Taijutsu, expected poor Fuinjutsu, expected moderate. Special notes, Puppeteer, displaying Ninjutsu to an unknown degree, caution advised, known to imitate himself with a puppet. Underneath was a collection of slightly blurry photos of a few of his puppets that looked like they had been taken during the Chunin exams. He couldn't help but grin at the bingo book entry. B rank was nothing to be too proud of, but it was the first concrete evidence of an international presence. This was going straight up on his wall next to his clipping of Sasori's profile. How soon can I expect it to update? If he was a Junin now, he damn well wanted people to know it. I expect around 2 days. I understand the people who publish the book are quite efficient in that regard. He gave a sly wink. They'll get a more recent photo as well. The blonde leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath and enjoying the moment. Well, I'll have to put a bit more effort in, it seems. No aliases. That'll have to change. He wondered how he could skew things for a more favorable epitaph. Something like a Kakonoha. A little too derivative perhaps. When he looked back down, he found the Hokage regarding him with an indecipherable expression. How are you doing, Naruto? Hokage-sama, it's been a long time since the two of us shared a bowl of ramen, hasn't it? Naruto allowed the tension to slip from his shoulders, opting for an easy smile and hiding the twang of melancholy that shot through his chest. His relationship with the Hokage had been a distant one ever since the affair with his first display of puppetry. Since then, Naruto was both too busy, and lacked any particular incentive to extend an olive branch. I'm hardly 8 years old anymore, he said, trying to sound as flippant as possible. And I suspect you're much too busy to be goofing off with one of your subordinates like that. The Sandaim's lips twisted wistfully. A sad truth of the job, yes, that I hardly seem to have time for the things that often feel more important to an old man like me. Naruto couldn't help but scoff. Self-deprecation doesn't suit you. I'm certain you could still take the majority of ninja in the village, probably even the continent. Something playful danced in the Hokage's eyes at that. I think you would be surprised, but thank you for humoring an old man. But anyway, this wasn't supposed to be about me. I asked you to hang back for another reason. He shifted in his chair in the way only a trained politician could, not displaying how uncomfortable he was with the topic, but conveying how serious it was all the same. You're an intelligent young man, Naruto, so I won't belittle you and assume you have no idea what I'm about to talk about. The blonde felt a tendril of ice wrap around his heart before he smothered it with prejudice, keeping his features perfectly straight. No doubt, you have noticed certain peculiarities about yourself as you grew up, such as your tremendous chakra capacity. Naruto almost wanted to sigh in relief, before he refocused his attention, knowing exactly what the Hokage was talking about. He drawled, so apparently Junin is mature enough to be told what everyone else in the village already knows. He took perhaps a little too much vindictive pleasure in the Hokage's slight wince. You are talking about the QB, right? Hiruzen sighed, suddenly seeming a great deal older. I suppose it was too much to ask that you wouldn't figure it out before I had the chance to tell you. The blonde smiled, although there wasn't much humor in the expression. It actually irritates me, in hindsight, how obvious it was, you know. My birthday, the way I was treated growing up, the seal on my stomach, although admittedly, that was only a recent discovery. He clicked his teeth, half in irritation, half in bemusement. It's not like I make a habit of channeling large amounts of chakra while shirtless in front of a mirror. He neglected the fact that it was actually Hanabi who noticed it first. Then there's the orange chakra. Hiruzen's eyes widened at that. You've tapped into the QB's chakra. He sounded quite alarmed at the prospect, and Naruto worried he may have said too much. Not consistently, no, he ran a hand through his hair. Only once actually, during the invasion. It allowed me to animate a puppet that would have been way too big to move otherwise. I've been trying to tap into it since, but I get sporadic results, at best. Naruto, Hiruzen stated warningly, I must ask that you stop experimenting with that chakra unsupervised at once. It's an incredibly dangerous and unstable source of power. But also incredibly powerful, right? Naruto shot back. Once I figured it out, I did my research. Jinchuriki are pretty uncommon, but not exactly undocumented. If I mastered the QB's power, that would be a huge advantage, right? Hiruzen took a deep breath, apparently weighing something in his mind. The truth is, Naruto, that we have no idea. While yes, other Jinchuriki of the Biju have met with varied success, the QB is simply different. There is no documented case of one of its containers ever using its power safely. But it's worth a try, right? Naruto asked, suddenly feeling excited. He would have experimented with the power anyway. It would be a crime to leave such a resource untapped, but to have legitimate support would be even better. That, the old man said, pursing his lips, is not up to me. Yeah, a new voice interrupted as a large man suddenly slipped into visibility from the side. You leave that kind of stuff up to the seal masters. Jiraiya, Hiruzen greeted in a somewhat strained tone. You could have introduced yourself normally. You were invited to the promotion meeting. The big man with spiky white hair falling down his back simply grinned. Where would the fun in that be? Besides, who says I wasn't at the meeting? You're going to give my guards anxiety attacks one of these days, the Hokage lamented dryly. His only response was the legendary Sannin pointing both of his fingers at one of the shadowed corners, clicking his teeth and giving the female Anbu hidden there a wink. Naruto watched all of this in silence, uncertain of how to react, or even think. He had heard of Jiraiya, of course. The Sannin's exploits were briefly touched on in the academy, and their fabled adventures were good fodder for fireside stories on long patrols. In none of those accounts did they ever mention him acting like this. So, the man exclaimed brightly, turning his sights on the confused blonde. You've been messing about with powers beyond your comprehension, and now you need the one, the only, bona fide, certified, electrified toad sage of Mount Myoboku to sort you out. Am I warm? Hiruzen smothered a sigh as he began filling his pipe. He seemed to smoke a lot more when any of his students were involved. Please just get on with it, Jiraiya. That seemed to take the wind out of the big man's sails, and he clicked his tongue at having his fun ruined. All right, brass tacks it is. He turned to Naruto, eyeing him up properly, the kind of gaze that a master butcher used to instantly find the choicest cuts of meat in a slab. Now that you know, or at least, have your suspicions confirmed about the QB, we can't just let you go around flinging that power willy-nilly. Enough Jinchuriki have gone mad from doing that, consumed by the thing they contained. Naruto swallowed, unsettled by how quickly the Sannin could switch between irreverent and completely serious. So you, my lucky little Junin, have the honor of being trained by yours truly. The facade was back on again, complete with a salesman's grin. We'll make sure you can safely use the fox's chakra, and I'll even slap the Myoboku guarantee on it. Still unable to find his voice, Naruto just nodded slowly. Despite his reservations though, he couldn't help but feel some excitement bubbling up. How often did someone get to personally train with a living legend? Useless. Naruto growled. He leaned back on his chair and just scowled at the ceiling, only to wince and look down again, nursing an ice pack against his temple. His head felt as though somebody had filled it with ball bearings before shaking it like a reticent pachinko machine. His arms still bore the pink hue of freshly regrown skin, and sitting back and complaining was just about the only thing he could do without experiencing the aches that racked his bones. Training, he calls it, he groused, switching sides with the ice pack. It didn't help, but it felt good to at least be doing something, instead of lying in a catatonic coma on his bed. He must know something of what he's doing, Hanabi offered, torn between feeling smug at her captor's condition, and annoyed that even in this state she was certain she couldn't do anything. Even she had heard about Jiraiya, mostly in relation to his exploits with Tsunade Senju, a much more interesting individual for a young kunoichi, but still. Shinobi didn't become legendary by being the bumbling fool Naruto described. Oh, I'm sure he knows exactly what he's doing, Naruto said, experimentally clenching his hand. Feeling was starting to come back at least. Acting as a scratching post while I rage about, completely out of control. Any idiot could come up with that plan. It's not exactly a tailored regime, is it? But you said he loosened the seal to do it. Surely only he could do something like that. Naruto looked down. The 8 trigram seal was still prominent on his stomach, chakra circulating his system in a desperate attempt to repair the internal damage the ill-fated excursion had done. He honestly wasn't sure. It didn't take a Fuinjutsu master to deduce it was a complex piece of work, but he hadn't devoted much time to studying. He, unlike a certain toad, was perfectly fine leaving the fox undisturbed. For now. Remind me to thank him for screwing up my control for the next week, he muttered, having vented most of his vitriol by now. Honestly, if that's all the QB's power does, turning me into some mindless berserker, I think I can do without it. You would turn down a source of power like that? Hanabi asked, surprised. I would turn down a stupid use for a power like that, yes. I'm a puppeteer, not exactly the direct engagement sort. He sighed, looking down at his hand thoughtfully. He had used the beast's power once already, without compromising himself by loosening the seal. He just needed to work out how he had done it that time, then replicate it. He could think of numerous uses for that much power, but not at the cost of lucidity. Hanabi merely huffed, walking toward the door to continue her training. She had hoped to have some fun at an injured Naruto's expense, but this mopey routine was just depressing. Then I don't see the problem. Just do it yourself, like you do everything else. She slammed the door behind her, hard enough to garner his attention. He stared after her for a moment, chewing on her words. He was certain she meant it as an insult, probably aimed at his insular nature and inability to open up to people in a significant way. But it struck a chord with him. Why wasn't he doing this himself? He had never forced himself to rely on other people's clunky, vague methods before. Was he going to change just because a supposed legend was involved? The Hokage had said it himself, this was untrodden ground. Jiraiya knew as little as anybody else, he was just tough enough to take the beating when he got it wrong. Mulling the thought over, he slid across the floor, thanking whoever had added wheels to chairs. He stopped next to the shelf containing the books he hadn't got around to reading yet. He was sure he had collected something on containment seals. He almost wanted to whistle as he looked over the mansion where the daimyo's son was being held. One of the proper, traditional types, with pagodas stacked one on top of the other. The target could have been in any of the 4 major buildings, but he was banking on the fact the little lordling would be held in the biggest, most opulent part of the compound. Nobles were so helpfully predictable sometimes. Everything had gone precisely as Shikaku had predicted. They had sprung the trap Kumo had set, but reversed it and ended up with the Junin most likely to have knowledge of the real target's position. He hadn't, but then, Konoha had known where the daimyo's son was held all along. That wasn't the point of the operation. He had been held in an underground bunker complex, one of many that Kumo had continued to maintain after the last war, for instances like this. While not uncrackable, an excursion into such a heavily fortified position for a target that was ultimately just going to be a sweetener for any deal Konoha negotiated later on, wasn't worth the effort. Maneuvering the target into an easier position on the other hand. Convoluted and circular planning like that was what the Nara clan thrived on. Naruto didn't know that this particular stroke of brilliance had actually been Shikaku's son's ploy, but then, he wouldn't have cared if he had. The daimyo acted predictably, fearing for his son's safety after Kumo's plan was already proved fallible. It didn't matter to him that his son's position hadn't changed an iota after the failed ambush, just that it looked as though Kumo was incompetent. Naturally, he had taken things into his own hands, placing his son under the rigorous care of his own samurai guard. Unfortunately, any shinobi worth his salt knew that a samurai's definition of protected was wildly different to that of a ninja's. The Kenjutsu masters were undoubtedly dangerous in a straight-up fight. But if Konoha wanted that kind of direct confrontation, they wouldn't be systematically gutting the current daimyo's power base. The blonde smirked at the thought as he dashed to the outer perimeter wall. The economics of the war was almost as fascinating as the actually fighting. He could follow simple incidents like a certain merchant being held up for a meeting with a noble, spiral into a full seizure of said noble's assets after an innocuous tip about certain illicit goods being held on their property. Subtle pushes on one domino, quickly growing into tidal waves more devastating than any battle between armies. An army without pay was as good as an army uncommitted to the fight. Kumo seemed to have noticed the fact that they had been waging the wrong war all this time and were trying to do hasty damage control, but it was much too late for that. They were swiftly growing to realize that the towns and villages they had taken as strategic points to push their line forward were useless to them. Konoha had stripped them of any utility long before pulling out of the region, relocating key businesses and sabotaging key supply routes. It was callous to the people that remained, but they were somewhat relying on the limitation of civilian casualties as an unspoken rule between the shinobi villages. Ninja that alienated their clientele quickly became poor ninja indeed. He almost felt sorry for the Cloud Village. 20 years ago, this would have all been a much fairer fight. Konoha, however, never fought a war the same way twice. The last international scuffle had been all about key battles deciding control of regions, and for that the Leaf Village had showy players like the Inoshika Cho Trio and Minato Namikaze, as well as a much greater supply of troops. They still hadn't fully recovered from the Kyuubi attack, and limited resources called for a much more lateral solution. Thus, Nara. He waited for the signal, 3 hoots of an owl that shouldn't be waking up for another hour at least, and scaled the perimeter wall. He had been provided a small team of Chunin for this mission, and for once he didn't have to suffer any backtalk or doubt over his plans. The relationship between a team and their mission leader when they were a Chunin or Junin was like night and day. His words held more weight, his opinion readily trusted. It was an odd sensation. Right now, the little 6-man team would be slowly taking out the guards, working from the outside in, backwards along the patrol routes they spent the last 3 days mapping. They were paired up, both to make sure that there were no hiccups in taking down the samurai, and so that one could replace the guards with hanged clones as they went. It was perhaps a little overkill, but lesser plans had been foiled by unforeseen visits during the mission. It did however mean that he had a much simpler time slipping across the courtyard, usually a killing zone for the archers stationed in the shadows of the pagoda. He could have strolled right across the open ground if he wanted to, but something was tickling the back of his neck. One of those indefinable feelings that all shinobi eventually developed. It made him uncomfortable, but he didn't hurry and kept his pace measured, always sticking to the shadows. They had chosen tonight because of the thin crescent moon. New moons were terrible for this sort of thing, as it allowed the defenders to develop their night vision. This way, there were still sufficiently deep shadows to hide in. Everything was going smoothly, as it should have, but all the same he couldn't help but feel nervous. His anxiety only grew as he leapt up onto the highest pagoda, slipping in through a window one of his teammates had already unlatched from the inside. The internal layout of the mansion was ingrained in his mind, and he took the various twists with ease as he moved like a phantom towards the lordling's chambers. A finger twitched and Arakun, sequestered on the other side of the building, rapped on the outside of the wall. The 2 samurai guarding the entrance to the room glanced at the door at the same moment, falling limply to the floor in the next as 2 senbon lodged in their neck. A shadow that had been clinging to the ceiling dropped down and grabbed the bodies, before making off with them down the corridor. A moment later the 2 samurai were up and active again, this time not so much as twitching when he walked right past them. The young noble was sound asleep, surrounded by his grandiose bed. He wondered if a noble would ever understand the value of security over comfort, before dismissing it. When Suna was turned into a beach resort, maybe. He walked over, feet padding as noiselessly as a cat's, and crushed a small pellet of sleeping agent over the teen's nose. He wouldn't be waking up for 8 hours, at least. More than enough time to get him back to Konoha. He moved to pick him up, only to pause. The hairs on the back of his neck weren't so much standing up, as they were trying to rip themselves out of his skin. He took in the quiet of the room carefully, senses straining for anything amiss. Quiet, except the noble's rhythmic breathing. Naruto immediately realized what was wrong. The breaths were too perfectly timed. In, out at precise, 2-second intervals. His eyes widened and he turned to get away, but the moment he moved even an inch away from the sleeping teen, the body abruptly swelled up to twice its size. The blast must have rattled his head, as the next thing he knew he was lying on his back, looking up at what used to be the main building of the compound, drastically reduced. The top 2 pagodas were gone entirely, now strewn around his prone form as random rubble. The whole thing was releasing a huge plume of smoke into the air, more than large enough to alert everyone in the region. His mind mechanically worked out how long it would take to respond from the nearest town before he realized what he was doing. He rolled onto his side, coughing out what felt like his whole lung. His throat felt raw, but at least there was no blood. A quick check revealed his only injury was a slight sprain in his neck, irritating, but hardly life-threatening. More pressing on the other hand, interesting, a low, gravelly voice spoke up. He sounded like he had inhaled a lot more smoke than Naruto had. I had hoped that you might notice my little ploy. This whole affair would have been quite unsatisfying otherwise. The blonde rolled to his feet, coming face to face with a strange sight. A man, or so he assumed from the voice, either absurdly squat, or hunched over to a ridiculous degree. A shugegasa and a large, patterned cloak concealed most of his features. Red clouds, that image tugged at something in his head, but he was still rattled from the explosion and it wouldn't connect. Wah, he tried to say, only to find his voice hoarse and unintelligible. The cloaked man huffed in amusement, lifting his head enough to reveal dark skin and a mouth covered by a ragged bandana. Ah, the frailties of flesh. Naruto swallowed, and it felt like caltrops were being forced down his throat, but it finally got some moisture in there. Where's my team? It almost surprised him that it was the first thing he thought of. An explosion like that would have immediately drawn his teammates to him, but they were notably absent. The man inclined his head slightly. I found none among them particularly worth attention, but they will be useful as part of the Legion, one suppose. He focused his gaze on the blonde, revealing eyes that were unnaturally white, with only small pinpricks for pupils. You, on the other hand, are quite fascinating. A Konoha puppeteer. I admit I had never imagined such a thing. In fact, a decade or 2 ago I might have been quite enraged by the thought. I owe my former home nothing, but I imagine they will be quite pleased to see you die before you can pass on your techniques. His words finally galvanized Naruto into action. He leapt back, drawing a large scroll from under his jacket and unraveling it in a smooth motion. 3 quick pulses of chakra, 3 puffs of smoke. The 3 puppets unsealed themselves and spread out before he even touched the ground again, 3 identical copies of Ramia, swaying warily. The man just observed it all in silence, apparently taking great interest in the appearance of his puppets. Truly fascinating. They are indeed different to Suna construction, but still using mechanical seal interfaces, a remarkable case of convergent evolution. He cracked his neck. Yes, I think I will greatly enjoy taking them apart, and any others you have designed. Usually a waste of time, I admit, but for this rare delight, I believe you have earned an introduction. He removed the shugegasa, tossing it to the side casually and revealing dark cornrow hair, held tight against his scalp. I am Akasuna no Sasori. He allowed a moment to let that sink in before hunching even lower to the ground, eyes gleaming with anticipation. Now, let the performance begin. Naruto froze, unable to believe his ears. This person, Sasori. Impossible. He couldn't even begin to reconcile this stocky, dark-skinned man with the youthful, pale-skinned, red-haired teen from the bingo book entry, proudly hanging on his wall. Admittedly, that image was decades old. Sasori wasn't exactly lining up for photo shoots since becoming a missing nin, but people didn't just change ethnicity like this. The obvious answer was that this was an imposter. His mind finally connected the dots. The red clouds. They were familiar because of scattered reports he had received through his spy network of a high-class mercenary organization that had recently begun offering their services for exorbitant prices. Only their perfect track record allowed them to demand so much money. It had been a novelty when he read it, because the group was supposed to be entirely comprised of S-class missing nin, of which there couldn't be more than a dozen across the continent. A group Sasori would more than qualify for. Sasori the puppeteer. How often had he himself foregone facing his opponent directly in favor of hiding behind a wooden facade? Why should his idol be any different? It almost wanted to make him laugh. Here Sasori was, in the metaphorical flesh, and all those questions he had wanted to ask the man growing up were suddenly pointless. He was about to fight the man he had looked up to for as long as he really understood what it meant to be a shinobi. More important than that, he supposed, he was about to fight an incredibly dangerous S-rank nuke nin, using the man's own specialty, that he had decades more experience with. Naruto felt a trickle of cold sweat creep down the back of his neck as he masked his emotions, eyes glancing about in a vain attempt to glean the other puppeteer's most likely hiding place. He wasn't fighting Kankuro though, and there were countless places across the compound a skilled shinobi could hide while keeping an eye on the fight. Naruto's singular advantage lay in Arakun. Even through the explosion he hadn't lost his connection to her. She was on the other side of the building, blown clear in the blast, but from what he felt she was still operational. It started without warning. Two of the demi-human puppets rushed forward, slithering forward faster than any natural snake could have. The third dived down, burrowing into the ground. Naruto couldn't use any but the most basic jutsu through his puppets, and that was only thanks to the naturally chakra-conducting properties of the resin he treated them with. Still, he could shunt a little earth-natured chakra through the strings connected to Ramia's hands, allowing her to tear through the earth as though she was merely swimming. It took him too long to learn even that much, one of the few times he had cursed his natural affinity for wind release. Sasori, or, if Naruto was correct in his assumption, his puppet, watched all of this dispassionately. He barely moved his head to track the two puppets flanking him, only deigning to move when one of them leapt forward, fingers separating into their long, prehensile cables. Naruto wished he had the chance to change out the poison coating their surface for something more corrosive, but he hadn't expected to fight a puppeteer today. An oversight he would be swiftly correcting. If he lived that long. His puppet closed on Sasori's, and the former Sunanins only moved when they were almost inches apart. Something silvery and fast abruptly interposed itself between them, a long, heavily segmented tail of some sort. It was comprised of flexible blades that shimmered with poison, a purple ichor of a shade Naruto didn't immediately recognize. He made to maneuver Ramia into a better position, but Sasori was simply faster. The tail snapped around again, moving at speeds belying its bulky appearance, and sheared clean through Ramia's wrists. Not missing a beat, the snake-based puppet leapt back, a quiet thwip denoting the small canister launched from its now open wrist. Sasori regarded it mid-flight, using his tail to slap it away, directly at where the second copy of Ramia was attempting to blindside him. Thinking on his feet, and knowing that his puppet was essentially a lost cause at that point, Naruto had the second Ramia open up her tail section, revealing the waiting hailstorm of kunai inside. The innocuous black canister landed squarely inside the bristling compartment, detonating not a moment later. The puppet was completely destroyed, but at least made itself useful by scattering a small armory of kunai in every direction. The unorthodox move, or more likely, his willingness to sacrifice a puppet so readily, must have caught Sasori off guard, as he reacted a second too slow. The tail blade made a valiant effort of staving off the onslaught, but there were too many to defend against completely. The cloak was shredded, revealing the strange, squat body beneath. It looked just like a man, crouched down on all fours, only with an enormous wooden oni mask worn on its back like some strange parody of a turtle's shell. The bladed tail emerged from the mask's mouth like the world's deadliest tongue, and a strange gauntlet affixed with canisters comprised its left hand. Otherwise, Naruto could see no obvious weaponry, although he wasn't willing to bet everything on the idea that what he saw was all there was. There was no pause to admire the puppet properly. Naruto's fingers continued to dance, directing Ramia back and forcing her tail to flick up. He didn't waste any time with the theatrics, tightening the stream of the water cannon all the way to its maximum. At the same moment he fired, Sasori's puppet turned, bandana sudden falling away to reveal an articulated mouth, opened too wide to ever be natural. It was Naruto's turn to face down a wall of steel as the puppet fired out a hail of senbon so fast they appeared as nothing more than glittering streaks in the air. The jet of concentrated water made it through, scoring a deep rent along the puppet's back, but it veered off as Ramia's body was repeatedly struck by the dull thunks of senbon peppering her body. It wasn't too damaging, although Naruto had to note that the impact seemed far more powerful than his own senbon launches. The real problem was when, in a stroke of truly abysmal providence, a single senbon managed to lodge right in the pipe of the water cannon. It happened too fast to prevent and, before the blonde could turn off the stream, the backlog burst out of Ramia's tail in a spectacular fountain that darkened the surrounding earth. Again, Naruto didn't allow his puppet's destruction to be in vain, opening up Ramia's mouth to fire out a rapid succession of adhesive globs. The awkward angle ensured that most missed, but at least two found their mark, splashing onto the other puppet's left leg and arm. Whatever that strange gauntlet was, Naruto wasn't eager on finding out what it did and was glad to see it neutralized. He also chose that moment to finally use his third Ramia copy, having her burst out of the ground directly beneath Sasori's puppet. He had apparently been anticipating this, withholding his bladed tail for it. Still, the sudden loss of two of the puppet's limbs proved too unstable a position to properly angle its attack. Instead of spearing through Naruto's puppet, the blade glanced off the tough scales lining her tail. Capitalizing on the brief advantage, the final Ramia closed in, making good use of her long body to completely wrap up Sasori's form and squeeze. Fully constricting like this, Ramia could bring about 2 tons of pressure to bear, more than enough to crush bone. Sasori's puppet groaned warningly. The blade tail rose again, poised like Sasori's namesake, and Naruto knew he would have to commit everything. Arakun dropped from the sky like a meteor, launching herself from the side of the building where Naruto had kept her sequestered for the majority of the fight. He forced her legs to extend completely, forming a conical spear tip between all 8 of them. Finally, between the pressure of Ramia's body, the small weakness opened up by the water cannon, and the devastating attack with Arakun's impressive weight behind it, Sasori's puppet couldn't take any more. The durable wooden carapace was smashed apart irrevocably, lost in the dust cloud resulting from Arakun's strike. Naruto immediately moved his puppets back, wary for any tricks Sasori might have planted in his puppet's shattered remains. It was what he would have done in the man's place. I concede, your mastery over the chakra strings is truly impressive for your age, Sasori's voice rang out again, only this time it wasn't deep or hoarse, but oddly youthful. I failed to notice the puppet you had hidden away, or perhaps it was my own arrogance in believing there was no way a child like you could control 4 puppets at once. A mistake I won't be repeating. Naruto's eyes had been darting about, either for Sasori's position, or for where his next puppet would come from. If they were all as strong as the last, he had a right to be worried. He only had a few more puppet scrolls sequestered over his body. He was surprised then, when his eyes passed over the falling dust cloud and spotted a single silhouette standing amongst the wreckage. This is turning out to be a fascinating exchange, Sasori said, smirking as his face was finally revealed. Don't you think? Impossible, Naruto muttered, taking in the sight of the man he had idolized for so long. Literally, the very same sight. Sasori didn't simply look like his bingo book photo, he might as well have taken it yesterday. It was like the man hadn't aged at all for the past 2 decades, still looking as youthful as that fresh-faced redhead that hung on Naruto's wall. I can see it, your surprise, the man intoned with an amused quirk to his lips. What you are seeing is the future you yourself might have attained one day had you not been unfortunate enough to meet me here today. The blonde's eyes couldn't stop their frantic search as they darted across Sasori's features. He knew instantly what he was looking at. The signs were subtle, but he couldn't not see them, knowing what he knew. The too perfect quality of the man's skin. The eyes that were glassy without being wet. The hair, artificially dyed to hide the subtle hints of damage. He had seen those features up close in kin, as he installed them himself. There were differences. Naruto had done all he could to ensure kin looked as far from human as possible. Sasori had done the opposite. What have you done to yourself? He muttered, horrified. Sasori seemed genuinely confused by the reaction. Ah, so you recognize me for what I am. That raises all sorts of interesting implications, doesn't it? Naruto immediately realized what he had unintentionally let slip and schooled his features, but the damage was done. Why would you pervert your body like that? He called out, quashing his own anxiety with indignation. Moral qualms? Sasori asked, interest replaced by bemusement. An unusual restriction for one in our profession. I have perfected myself, locked my body against the ravages of time, youthful, eternal, a work of art. Naruto's lips twitched down. You've crippled yourself, he shot back without thinking, watching as Sasori frowned. You've locked yourself in place, unable to change, to adapt. You've assumed your own perfection in a single moment and lost any chance of seeing what else you could do, what other heights you could climb. You don't know what you're talking about, Sasori growled, any previous hint of amusement wiped away. My body is perfection, able to be changed and rebuilt without any of the risks and detriments of the flesh. Naruto's mind was racing, trying to reconcile this crippled, delusional man with the image he had held sacrosanct in his head for years. I thought you of all people would understand. I thought we would be the same, he muttered under his breath, more to himself than his opponent. That was naive, to assume as much from someone I didn't know. Still, the revelation that the one man he had based his life around, that had set his life on its current course, wasn't what he believed. There was no metaphorical stab of pain, or a sudden unraveling of his whole life view, but it hurt, a dull ache emanating from his chest. Perfection is the crest of a wave, you can't capture it, only let the experience of it move you to trying again. He looked up, meeting Sasori's glassy, unnatural eyes. You're just an old man afraid of death. And you are a child, the Nin replied coldly, eyes narrowed, too used to running your mouth without anyone correcting you to know when you have said too much. His features reset, falling back into a mask of cool indifference as he reached into his robe. I had intended to draw this out a little longer before allowing you the honor of becoming a work of art like myself, a gift to a fellow practitioner. His features darkened as he unraveled the scroll. But now I just feel like my time has been wasted. I hate have my time wasted. It all happened so fast. Naruto sent his puppets forward to prevent Sasori from unsealing his own, Ramiya darting forward like an uncoiled spring, Arakun turning to spray the man with strings of liquid adhesive that would harden like steel in contact with his skin. Instead, there was a puff of smoke and a rush of something through the air, and Naruto felt his connection with Ramiya abruptly severed. No, not just severed, Ramiya herself was completely destroyed. He couldn't even feel a fragment large enough to latch onto with one of his strings. A profound sense of fear, the likes of which he hadn't felt since the Forest of Death, when he had been alone and without his puppets for the first time ever, gripped his spine. The smoke cleared and Sasori's puppet was revealed, hovering next to the man like a grim bodyguard. Naruto was sickened to say he recognized the face. He had been excited by all aspects of Suna's culture as a child, gleefully delving into their history before focusing his research more tightly. The Sandaime Kazakage hadn't aged well in the 2 decades he had been missing. I would introduce the two of you, Sasori started, the threads connecting his fingers to the puppet pulsing once as if to say, it doesn't matter if you can see them, but in all honesty, I grow tired of this. I think I'll end you swiftly now, spare myself the trouble later. Naruto tensed, whipping out the 2 scrolls he still had on his body, a final copy of Ramiya and a second Arakun, and braced himself. If there's one thing I can guarantee, he said, with confidence he sure as hell didn't feel, it's that I won't let this be quick. Sasori's fingers flexed and the enormous mass of iron filings, held aloft by the Kazekage's usurped power, shifted menacingly. I doubt it. Despite his small, stubborn boast, it was over in less than 3 minutes, long for a fight between ninja, but not for a fight between 2 similarly matched shinobi. Sasori was just better. He worked his puppet faster and more dexterously, and the power of the Kazekage himself was immense. While clearly bastardized compared to what the man himself was supposed to be capable of, Sasori's crude but experienced workings of the Jiten was more than a match for what puppets Naruto still had on him. Arakun was crushed first, trapped in a shrinking prison of metal that she had no hope of escaping. Ramiya lost an arm, then was taken through the chest by a metal spike that swiftly expanded to twice its size. He tried to use the water cannon, but it splashed harmlessly against a hastily raised wall of shifting metal filings. The other Arakun was the last to go, squashed flat under a wide panel of metal like the spider she was based on. From there, it was a foregone conclusion that saw Naruto lying on the ground, clutching at the gash on his arm. It was a minor wound, one that he would have easily ignored otherwise. Sasori's poisons, however, were on another level. The entire right side of his body was aflame, burning like it had been dipped in acid. There was no welcoming numbness as the poison slowly destroyed his nerves either. No, this one was clearly designed to be felt. Through it all, he hadn't been able to so much as brush the man's cloak. That's a rather recent blend, Sasori muttered, looking down at him dispassionately. It was usually a silly thing to do, just asking for his downed opponent to pull a last-minute reversal. The Kazekage still hovered over his shoulder though, and a single twitch of his finger could end Naruto's life in an instant. Even if he wasn't, Naruto's mind was too consumed by pain to even think of attempting anything. You're the first opponent to feel it, but don't worry, it's been extensively tested. You have about 4 hours by my best estimate, 4 hours of agony to think on. The man, although whether he could still be called that was debatable, clicked his tongue and pulled his cloak about him. I had intended to elevate you, allow you a taste of perfect, eternal art. This will suffice instead. Enjoy your last few hours Uzumaki Naruto. Hopefully your body will serve as a warning to those who try to grasp outside their means. With nothing more to say, the man turned and walked away, his pace measured, leisurely almost. Naruto continued to writhe, clutching at a wound that was the least of his worries. He barely even heard the man's little speech, his mind was racing too fast. His body shook from the effort of just moving his arm away from the gash, reaching into one of his many pockets. His shivering fingers fumbled about, struggling to remember where he kept them through the haze of pain. Eventually, they closed on a small vial of greenish liquid, quickly popping the cap off and pouring it into his mouth. It took a moment to coax his throat into swallowing, and he lost a good amount, dribbling it down his chin like an invalid. But it worked. He gasped gratefully as he sucked in a lungful of uninterrupted air. He turned on his side and held down his bile. If he retched now he risked throwing up the general-purpose antivenom he had just ingested. The fiery burn in his veins reduced to a tolerable throb, painful, but manageable. It was a stopgap measure at most though. None of his poisons would be stopped by such a puerile measure, he damn well expected Sasori's wouldn't. What it did give him was clarity. The clarity to start sprinting back to Konoha as fast as his increasingly unresponsive body was able. Hanabi jumped as the door slammed open, Naruto practically falling across the threshold in his haste. He looked terrible, washed out instead of simply pale, his clothes unkempt and dirtied from a fight. The veins on his neck stood out prominently, a violent blue against the sickly pallor of his skin. There was a wildness to his clumsy movements as he stumbled across the floor, legs looking like they would give up on him at any moment. Still, as he breathed heavily and visibly struggled to stay awake, he scrabbled at the reagents on one of his shelves, practically throwing them towards the chemistry equipment in the kitchen. In his haste, he had left the door wide open, emitting a slight breeze into the room, but Hanabi barely noticed, too transfixed by her apparently dying captor. She had seen him poisoned before of course, he did it to himself all the time. Never like this though, never to such a serious degree. He threw together a hasty mixture, dropping his own blood in it, he wasn't in short supply with the still bleeding gash on his arm. Fascinated, Hanabi watched as the mixture fizzed, turning a pale, milky color. Naruto cursed and began mixing another tincture, his movements visibly slowing, becoming sloppy. He knocked a few bottles of chemicals to the floor in his hurry, without even appearing to notice. He repeated the process a few times, each mixture turning a different color, more and more similar in shade each time until finally the last two both turned the same dark shade of blue. Nodding to himself and muttering incoherently at this point, Naruto nearly tripped over his own feet as he began preparing a new solution. It looked complicated. Hanabi barely recognized half the ingredients he mixed in. Still, the blonde moved with as much confidence as his failing body would allow until he finally lifted a small flask of pale yellow liquid and placed it on a hot plate. He was forced to support himself against the counter as he waited for the mixture to heat, muscles straining over even that simple effort. Hanabi could see each muscle fail in turn, slowly drawing in from his extremities. It was like watching a man die in slow motion which, she realized with no small amount of morbid curiosity, was exactly what she was seeing. Naruto had clearly been severely poisoned, perhaps even lethally so, and she was just standing there, like a deer staring down a kunai in flight. Even with that thought in mind, she couldn't move. Her body remained frozen, waiting to see how this played out. Naruto was barely clinging to the counter now, staring at the anti-poison with desperate anticipation as the mixture slowly turned translucent. Only when the entire mixture turned clear did he reach for it, only for his legs to slip out from under him. He crashed to the ground, but immediately struggled to regain his feet again, clawing at the counter that offered no support. He was still reaching towards the anti-poison, but even his fingers were shaking. No, he croaked as his other arm gave out, causing him to twist in place to sit, propped up against the counter. He tried to move, but his limbs were gone, reduced to twitching lumps that might as well have been chained in place. His eyes grew unfocused, blurry from the poison or from his own tears, it didn't matter. His breathing picked up in strange, stilted gasps that grew in tempo as his body began to hyperventilate, starved of oxygen at a cellular level. Hanabi finally realized what she was doing and started forward, only to pause. What did she owe him? He was her captor and this was her chance. She could feel it now, the steady breeze from the door. In his haste, Naruto must have forgotten to close any of the doors on his way in. She had a straight shot for the outside, fresh air, freedom. She turned only to hover indecisively, glancing back at the catatonic blonde. His jerky breathing had reached a crescendo, beginning to slow again as one by one his internal organs gave out from the strain. Each rise and fall of his chest was slower than the last, each one bringing him that step closer to the last. Still, she hovered. Despite everything, she didn't want Naruto to die. He had been unyielding in her imprisonment, but he hadn't been cruel. He had allowed her to train, knowing full well it slowly weakened his position. More than that, he had actually shown interest in her abilities, in her growth. With one last glance between the door and Naruto, she sighed, making her choice. Naruto wouldn't have thought that death felt like an awful hangover, although, considering the life he'd led, he supposed it was somewhat tame. It took him about a minute of just breathing to finally convince himself that, yes, he was in fact still alive, somehow, and yes, he was going to have to deal with the throbbing pain behind his eyes. He lay there for a moment, trying to remember what had happened. He remembered making it back to Konoha, using one of the Anbu tunnels that skirted the wall so he wouldn't have to waste time explaining himself at the gate. He hadn't trusted himself not to collapse the moment he saw another friendly ninja, and like hell he was entrusting himself to the medics at the hospital. No, not for a poison concocted by Sasori of all people. He had made it back to his building and nothing, his mind blanked. Had he prepared an antidote in time? Clearly, he must have, but he had no recollection of it. He opened his eyes, thankful that the room was kept dim, and tried to look around. The moment he moved his head, the throbbing pain became a sharp stabbing, making him gasp. All that served to do was remind him how parched his throat felt. Another pain to add to the list. It's lucky I have good eyes, Hanabi remarked somewhere to his left. It was hard enough following what you did, never mind with which ingredients. The blonde groaned, fragments of hastily testing his blood for numerous different toxins flashing through his head. You're also lucky that I got really curious about your top-shelf books a few weeks ago, she continued. It's how I knew that antidotes with senyal leaf extract need to be constantly administered over a few hours. Speaking of which, Naruto felt something pressed against his lips and, heedless of the fact that it could be just about anything, he drank. If Hanabi had wanted to kill him, this was the most absurdly roundabout way she could go about it. The liquid was cool, and he could taste the slight hints of cherry. Was Sasori's poison a hybrid blend? He found those tended to be a bit finicky with the dosages. A flash of memory from the previous night confirmed the thought. You didn't run, he muttered, turning to face her when the dull ache in his body bled away. Yeah, well, some of us actually have morals, you know. It's not like I could just leave you to die on the floor. He choked out a short chuckle, letting his head flop back. You should have. It would have been the shinobi thing to do. No, the girl shot back. The Konoha shinobi thing to do would be to bring you in alive so you can answer for everything you've done. His head lilted to the side again and he was happy that he'd regained enough control to raise a bemused eyebrow. You have a very naive viewpoint of the world. Have I told you that? Only about every other day, she grumbled. But really, why save me? You have to know that now that I'm awake I still won't let you leave. He emphasized the point by pulling himself upright. The pain returned, but he quashed it under a mask of indifference, refusing to show weakness now that he was conscious again. If he prepared the antidote correctly, a few more doses would be all it took to get him back up to par. There might be lingering damage, but he would have to take this one step at a time. Like I said, I couldn't just leave you dying like that. He just stared at her, and even knowing that he was weaker than she had ever seen him, she still wilted under his gaze. It was almost reflex by now. Maybe I was just curious, she deflected hotly, turning away to hide that fact that she herself didn't fully understand why she had done what she did. Maybe I just wanted to know who could poison you of all people. He relented after a few more seconds, turning to the side to stare at the wall. Bakenako that push the pail, often find they lose their tail. No more deals for simple cats, no more thoughts than chasing rats. He recited absently. What? He blinked, realizing what he said. He still must have been out of it from the poison to let his thoughts slip so easily. An old proverb the Hokage told me once. He set his mask back in place, smirking at her as he pushed off the bed, making sure he didn't so much as wobble when he regained his feet. You've probably heard it as curiosity killed the cat. She just stared at him in that impudent way only children could manage. It was Sasori, he admitted. It didn't really cost him anything, except maybe a bit of pride. He felt he had lost enough of that today that a bit more didn't really matter. The Sasori? Hanabi asked, glancing to the bingo book entry still tacked the wall. The page was beginning to yellow with age. Thankful for the reminder, Naruto stalked over, moving his feet carefully to prevent stumbling, and ripped the page off the wall. He looked at it once before crumpling it into a ball and deftly tossing it in a nearby bin. Yes, that's Sasori. He didn't say anything else as he walked towards the kitchen. He needed to get started preparing his next dose of antidote, and he also needed to get his thoughts straight. He suddenly had a great deal to sort out in his head. About his path, about the man he had considered an idol, about the girl he had kidnapped and had just saved his life. As he gripped the counter, suppressing a small tremor in his hand, he wanted to groan. When had things grown so complicated? That will be it for this video. If you want more, comment down below, like, subscribe. And see you guys later.